Hello, guys. Welcome to Talking with Wizards with myself, Jeremy White, and Kelly Laird.
Yay! Here we are, finally.
This is a new platform we're using. We're really liking it, but we are still noobs at it, so bear with us. This discussion this week, I've got another phone called Walking with Wizards, and we brought about Talking with Wizards so we could just talk about the subjects that interest us and hopefully interest you guys out there. But I've just been watching the latest Viking series, which is great for entertainment, but it is historically quite inaccurate in a way that really undervalues the history and actions of some remarkable people that are our ancestors. And it's really important when we embrace the sagas and the stories that we remember to tell the truth of who they are. Don't underrate or undermine anyone. We can make the story smoother, we can make it cleaner, but we cannot make somebody out to be a villain when they're not. And I'll talk about that later. But also the same, we're going to talk about some very important stories, like what Hollywood's done to the Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of the greatest Arthurian tales and is one of my favorites. But in the story, it has actually none of the real magic that you need and the purpose of what the tale is about. Do you want to add anything to that, Kels?
No, I think that's really so important because we've seen so many modifications to these stories through time. And of course, there's been modifications through various lenses anyway, but to really see it represented on the big screen has really been somewhat troublesome, I guess, or troubling to me as well.
Well, I think the people who make the film really didn't get the story in the first place. If they did, the actual real story is far more magical and mythical. I mean, I don't want to tell the whole story of Gawain and the Green Knight. We put up the image of the Gawain and the Green Knight. So it's an archetypal story, and it's about a knight, the very best knight, going on a quest for a year and a day. And at the end of that quest, he either has to solve a riddle or give his head away. But actually, in the movie, they're not talking about the riddle at all. And he's not the bestest of knights. Everything is slightly wrong. And at the end of the movie, you're left scratching your head. The story itself is absolutely wonderful. And I'll probably post that one day on here to hear it. But it is so profound and so eye-opening and wonderful. All of that is lost from the movie. Now, I don't know why the directors and producers didn't understand the riddle. It's quite simple. The riddle of the Gawain and the Green Knight, I can't really talk about it without saying it, is that the Green Knight gives him a quest. Either meet him a year and a day and have his head severed, or solve the riddle of what all women want in their lives. And then Gawain goes on a quest across all the lands to try and solve that riddle. And eventually he comes across Sir Bertie Lack in a house, and through the experiences, he stays there for 3 nights. And in the end of that, he realizes what it is that all women want. Right at the end of the movie, rather than the Green Knight take his head, he solves the riddle. Everyone goes, oh, of course it is. But in the movie, it's lost all of that magic, all of that power. And it's sort of not diluted, it's eradicated the story in the Green Knight. Most people who saw it thought, wow, that's a really weird film. And the weird is what most people thought, which is not. When I tell that story of Gawain and the Green Knight, it leaves people at the end of it in wonder, which it should do. This is a story that's been told since the 11th century, and it's always been a great Christmas tale because it's set at Christmas. But what were these people thinking? And then we move on to the latest Viking series. And it's not just, I could talk about the inaccuracy in history over and over again. Sorry, Kels?
Can we go back to Gawain and the Green Knight? Because many people probably haven't actually seen the movie. So how does the movie contradict what the actual storyline was?
So Gawain in the movie is a drunkard. He's not worthy of being a knight. He's the nephew of King Arthur. And also King Arthur is quite a strange character. Gawain's mother is a witch. She summons up the Green Knight, who's a demon, as opposed to being, it is actually the Green Knight comes to challenge Arthur, and Gawain steps up and takes on the challenge. And he's the Winter King, the Green Knight. He's the Holly King. And that's really important, that at the darkest of the winter, he is the green and still full of the life of the forest. He's a jovial character. This Green Knight is very sinister. And all of the things that Gawain appears in this movie, all the trials and all the tests he goes through, none of them come across as seeing chivalrous. None of them come across as making any sense. It's like a nightmare. But actually, in the story, each one of the tests and the trials is important to help Gawain get to the end quest.
Yeah, it's one of the most pivotal stories. I mean, we do what is called the Northern Gateway initiation, and to me, this storyline is one of the most powerful. I mean, all of them are, that really opens the mind as to what is really being told through the lens of the stories. You know, what really is happening within these archetypal tales.
Yeah, and we started the Northern Gateway to actually tell the stories. And through telling the stories, they actually became an initiation, because people were changed after we told these ancient tales that our ancestors gathered around fires to hear. And we discuss, and then we take people on journeys, shamanic journeys, based around what they've experienced in the journey or the story, or what the story's brought up from. And this is how our children generations ago were educated, helped to understand life. Those quests, all based around a thing called the breaking of the fairy accord. And we talk about the stories of a French bard called Chrétien de Troyes, who was one of the 12th century mystics. But within all these Arthurian tales, there's always a thread of mystery, a thread of wisdom, a thread of teachings. And each quest has a purpose. Within the quest in the movie, it has no purpose. It's a bit like a Guy Ritchie's King Arthur movie. It completely, if you know nothing about King Arthur, it's a great movie. But if you know the purpose of King Arthur and the stories and the legends and the myths, you're completely befuddled at what's going on. Where does this? No, Merlin has no role whatsoever, but Merlin is important. He's the mentor on the hero's journey. He comes forward. It's interesting, the Arthurian story, because Arthur is supposedly buried at Glastonbury Abbey, and the next character we're going to talk about is best buried in Glastonbury Abbey. And the next character is a guy called, I'm going to talk about who he is in the Viking series. So the new Viking series, which is about Leif Erikson and Canute. This character, Edmund, is the weakling son of Ethelred the Unready. I'll talk about that later. Who finally is defeated in one battle, and then he's tricked in it, and then he's slain as a weakling, and he's very dislikable, and that's it, he's out of the city. But the real Edmund, the son of Ethelred the Unready, is called Edmund Ironside, because the Vikings couldn't beat him. It was them that gave him that name. He was undefeatable in battle. The series starts with the St. Brice's Day massacre, which is when all the pagans across Britain, under the orders of Ethelred the Unready, doesn't really mean not ready, it means unadvised or ill thought out, is what unready means. And so he had this massacre of all Danes, as many as they could, to be slaughtered on St. Brice's Day. In the Viking series, then Canute decides to come to Britain and take the throne. But actually, it was his father, Svein Forkbeard, who led that invasion. And it was 10 years after the event. The event happened in 1002, and in 1013, Sven came because his sister was one of those who were slaughtered in the Danelaw. He comes into Britain. He defeats Ethelred the Unready, who then leaves the country and goes to live in France. And Sven Forkbeard makes himself the king of England. Ethelred the Unready has 3 sons. The first 2 die. Edmund, who was already a great warrior of renown and nobility and had made his money by fighting, he even owned the sword of the great King Offa, given to him in battle. He then decides to fight. So what happens is, in 1013, Sorry, 1014, Sven dies. And Canute comes to claim the throne, and Ethelred the Unready comes back from France because the Witan, or the Council of England, want to give it back to a Saxon king. But Canute comes back, and then in 1016, Ethelred the Unready dies, and Canute claims the crown. But Edmund fights a battle, and they fight many, many battles. And finally, at the Battle of Assendon, there are Saxon lords. One's called Eorik Styroka, and he's what we call a traitor. He retreats and joins Canute at the battle, and even then they can't beat Edmund. And actually, before the battle, Edmund offered Canute to fight in hand-to-hand combat, and Canute refused because his army was bigger. So at the end of the battle, they stopped and realized that neither of them could win. So they decided that Edmund would live in Wessex and all the places below London, and Canute would be king above. And whoever died first would take the throne of England. Strangely enough, 2 months later, Edmund dies. Nobody knows how he dies. But what's interesting is that Eorik Styroka, the Lord of Mercia, is believed to have done it. And he believes one of the rumors that came up maybe 100 years later is that Edmund was on the lavatory and he was pierced in the bowel by an assassin, and he died a horrible death. I believe that Eorik Styroka, Lord of Mercia, had something to do with it, because Canute had him beheaded not long after Edmund's death because he was a traitor and he hated that. And then Edmund was buried in Glastonbury Abbey, and Canute, who was so not in awe, but respect for a worthy enemy, he travelled to Glastonbury and sat by his grave, the anniversary of the year after his death, and he laid a cloak that was embroidered with peacock feathers over the crypt, which means he hopes he's resurrected soon. That is a lot of respect for your enemy. But in the Viking series, he's seen as a weak atheling, which means a prince who would be king. And I just think, to honor our ancestors, especially historical figures who were accurate, they need to be mentioned properly. And actually, one of Edmund's allies within this time is a person called Uhtred of Northumbria, who is the same Uhtred of Bedinburgh from the Last Kingdom. But Canute kills him as well. So they've picked certain characters to glamorize and make all the other ones quite weak. And what's interesting is, in most of the Viking series, they always make the Saxons be really horrible. You know, it's always he was a great man.
But why do you think? What's their purpose of doing that? I mean, what do you think their ultimate goal is by changing the storyline so greatly?
Well, it's interesting. Edmund Ironside is such a great character to have as a foe within a series. He would have been really incredible to see. The fact that he challenged Canute to hand to combat, the fact that he was such a brave warrior that the Vikings gave him that name. You know, that would have enhanced the show. I don't understand whether they just decided that they were going to make Canute the hero and everybody else was a lesser person. I don't know. But Canute did become called Canute the Great. But that was because he had a northern empire, which was Norway, Denmark, and England. And Norway then included, I think, Sweden as well, he had as well. You know, so he was a great king. But his enemy was a great man too, and doesn't need to be betrayed as a weakling coward. You know, and it sort of not hurts me, it drives me mad. Same with things like Braveheart, William Wallace in the battle, you know. It's great to watch the movie, but the final battle, the Battle of Stirling, we've got brave Scotsmen charging in kilts against men in heavy armor on horse, and the brave Scotsmen in kilts win. But actually, it's the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the battle fought on a bridge. They still won, but that needs to be shown properly. It just drives me nuts.
Yeah. Well, you're such an avid historian. You have the recall of these, you know, these things that, of course, you've been studying for all of your life, that it's a fascinating conversation for those of us that are not, they don't keep that replay in their mind, nor were they taught it properly in school or whatever that was, because we all know that our history lessons across the board were lacking a lot. So it's pretty fascinating to hear the differences.
So it was interesting. This came up from my research to do this show. I live in a place called Weston-super-Mare. It's on the borders of Glastonbury, on the levels, but it used to be called Winterstoke. It's the home of the Winter people. And out across the Severn Estuary, Bristol Channel towards Wales, is an island called Steephome. And that's the first place that King Arthur was ever written about by a monk called Gildas. And from that first monk writing down, all of these legends have come. That man actually existed because Gildas didn't like him. They wrote about him. And then just after that, the Saxons wrote a story about, it's called Cathandwy or something like that. It's a strange, I think it's a Welsh poem. It talks about a Saxon knight who died, the Grey Knight, and the crows were flying around the castles, and the kings and the bards were saying, yeah, he was a great knight, but he wasn't really an Arthur, was he? Which means Arthur was known at that time as being a great knight. And without a shadow of a doubt, Arthur was a Christian. He was a Romano-Briton, and he was a Christian. So, and even his enemies honored him. And that throws back to the Viking series, that the enemies honored Edmund Ironside because he was a great warrior. So we need to remember that and portray them as that person. And even where I live, those hills where battles took place have changed in the history books. I have no idea why.
Right, I know, because you also speak of when we're doing the Avalon tour that you walk us through. You speak of, is it where?
Alfred the Great.
Yeah, Alfred the Great. You speak of all these landmarks.
Yeah, we talk about at school. We learned about Alfred the Great burning the cakes in Athelney. But Alfred the Great was the most pious king of Britain's ever known. But nowhere in that story, Athelney is about 3 miles outside Glastonbury. Glastonbury was the biggest abbey in the whole of Europe. Why don't they mention Glastonbury? Why don't they mention the Isle of Avalon? The Battle of Eddington, we're told, is in Wiltshire, but actually, Eddington is just another 4 miles outside Glastonbury on the Somerset levels. And it's where Alfred defeated Guthrum. And they say then he baptized him. Well, the baptism was called the Treaty of Wedmore, which is another place that's 5 miles outside of Glastonbury. So if the battle was in Winchester, why is it called the Treaty of Wedmore? It's because they seem to want to take away the story from this area. And I believe the history resonates in the names and the towns all around. And I actually believe that Glastonbury and Avalon, because of Brent Knoll, which is where the Vikings fell, uphill, where Ubba Ragnarson's buried, Eddington is equally important for those who want to understand our Saxon, Norse, and Viking history as well.
Well, and I want to mention real quick for those of you that are tuning in, and I can see that there's quite a few. I can only see some comments. It looks as though I'm learning the platform, but I know that Sergey, thank you, Sergey, for being here, mentions how inaccurate is the Last Kingdom, and I know that you spoke to that. But do you want to expand on that at all? From your lens?
The Last Kingdom's probably 90% accurate. It's probably one of the best ones. The Viking series is like a comic book. It's great. The names of the people are mentioned, the characters are mentioned, but historically it's all a bit all over the place. But it's great to watch. And for people who have never known these stories and want to sit, it's great. I hope it inspires them to go and look up who these people were. Look up Emma of Normandy. Look up Edmund, Ethelred the Unready, and find out about who these people were. Because they're the ones who actually lived in those times. And if you think Edmund Ironside was dead by the time he was 27, but the life he lived, this is how do we gauge a life? Is it somebody who lives 100 years and doesn't do anything, or somebody who lives 27 and his name goes down in history forever? It's really important that if we see a story, go and research it. Look, we all have the ability now to go online and to say, well, I saw this character, let's look at this. Now, the Last Kingdom, the character Uhtred of Bebbanburg did exist, but he existed in the time of Edward Ironside, not the time of Alfred the Great. So
and I think it's important too to pass along those stories to our youth. I think that so much of what we live today, they're learning through this convoluted lens in a way, the stories.
Yeah, and it's the first time I've ever seen on a TV that the St. Brice's Day massacre was mentioned. And that's important because the Daneland, or their Danes, or the Vikings, whatever you want to call them, had been living in Britain for over 150 years. They weren't Scandinavians anymore. They were like third, fourth generation Britons, but they were still seen as outsiders. So they weren't accepted. And that was Christianity, because they were pagans. They wouldn't accept Christ. Now, in the Viking series, the latest one, that is quite interesting, the way they portray that, because it's set at the time when the pagans, the Christians, are being incredibly violent to the pagans. And there's no love lost between the two of them. You're either a Christian or you're a pagan and follow the old ways. In the series, they rape and pillage Uppsala and kill all the priestesses and all the priests. Those events did happen. 100 years later, we have the Northern Crusade, which was to convert everyone to Christianity, or if not, put them to the sword. And that's when we talk about those healers, those divine women, the guardians of the wells, all being driven into the forest or driven into hiding.
Which lends to the breaking of the Fairy Accord.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for those who don't know what the Fairy Accord is, that's the contract between the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And many organized religions break that by not understanding the role of the divine feminine in the universe, basically, and how we're supposed to honor them, their role in the sacred line of things. So when you start dishonoring the divine feminine, all things become out of balance. And that's where the Arthurians legends come into a damsel in distress. It's not because the damsels are weak. It's because we need to undo the things that we have done. And we're talking about Ukraine today, and there's reports of rapes and looting. That's just war. That's just soldiers. That's what they do. And it's happened right the way through history. It will happen again. But those crimes need to be put right later.
Right. I mean, I think with that, just that expression, I mean, we can't just say that's just war. We want to change that trajectory. Yeah, it is war, but those kind of violations, that's part of this pattern, this cycle that needs to be rectified or broken or something. I mean, it's got to shift. We got to shift some things here somewhere along the way.
Yeah, and it's also, if the people have a real hero to rise up and follow, history seems to write them out of the books. So we all heard of Robin Hood, but there's a lot more important characters in British history than Robin Hood. There's one called Hereward the Wake, who was about not long after the Last Kingdom. So sorry, the current Viking series. He's just after 1066 when the Normans invaded. And he's probably the greatest hero in British history. But he's been written out of history completely because he was a rebel that fought a war against the Normans for 7 years. A lot of the stories of Robin Hood fighting the Sheriff of Nottingham, who were the Norman overlords, come from Hereward the Wake. And I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Ivanhoe. There's a Robert Taylor film from like the 60s called Ivanhoe with Elizabeth Taylor. That's based on Hereward the Wake. But they won't use that name because the Normans banished it from history. And that's what happens a lot. The victors write the history. But we need to remember the names.
Yeah. Yep.
There's a very interesting book by a gentleman called Charles Kingsley. I think it was written in the early 20th century, and it's called Hereward the Wake, The Last Great Englishman. And once again, he was a Dane, and he was a bard, he was a singer, he was handsome, he could woo women. A great character. And far more. And there's another character called William Marshall. A few people may have heard of him. He is the perfect knight in shining armor. He was an incredible guy. And they need to make movies about him. And in the last Robin Hood film, William Marshall's in it, plays like a sidekick role to the Robin Hood character who was Russell Crowe. So it's, but what Hollywood likes doing is picking the same story and telling it over and over again because people already know the story.
Yeah, through a different lens, a different trajectory. But I really, I mean, so much because we have these conversations along the way. I see you sitting in the corner and watching these and doing commentary throughout the whole thing because, again, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, I don't want to be a party pooper. I want people to enjoy the story. I just want the people who write the story to honor the essence, honor the facts. If one guy's a great hero, why make him out to be a villain? You know, and especially if you mean it all, I suppose it's history, isn't it? I suppose the people who tell the story of Geronimo now make him a hero, but the people who told the story of Geronimo in the late 1800s didn't see him as a hero. So it depends, it's who's telling the story.
Sure, I think it's always interpreted through the lens of another, but what is the benefit for them through that lens, right? I mean, there's altered stories, and as history and where we are today, you know, the layers of the onion continue to be peeled back, and all of a sudden we discover something else about a supposed hero or not, and then, oh, what this is the real truth. So
yeah, there's another. Have you ever heard of Vlad the Impaler?
We've spoken of it before, but yeah, share.
Yeah, so he's the original Dracula, but through history, because he was seen as an outsider, he was seen as a strange. He's become the devil or Dracula, Dracul, the dragon, basically in history. But actually, he was a hero to his people. He saved his country from the Ottoman Empire. You know, and it's just through the eyes of somebody who wants to write the story, or this person's evil. I just like, if I'm watching a historical program, I want to know who these characters really were. Who was this man? And it doesn't really matter. They could have made Edmund Ironside really dislikable, really horrible, but they wouldn't make him any less of a great warrior. But instead, they made him a rubbish warrior who dies a coward's death, which is not what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting because, you know, of course, I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't.
Yeah, Kels, where can I see all the comments there? Is that over there? I'll go
yeah, and again, on the comment section, apparently because we're broadcasting to a number of Facebook pages and a YouTube channel, and apparently, I didn't know this because this is the first time we've done a broadcast. It says that there's limitations. So I'm trying to pick up on things, and I don't see anything that I'm missing, but that's not necessarily the case. So I apologize in advance. We'll figure it out for next time.
Yeah, we've got to work out which is the best platform. And also, I want to mention, if anybody is watching this on YouTube, hopefully we'll get a banner along the bottom saying, please subscribe and like. So we can get more profiles, people watching, and I'm going to tell more stories, and we're going to talk about stuff like this. And that's what Talking with Withers is going to be about. The next one, we're going to probably talk about crop circles.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that.
And we'll get some nice images because I live in a place that's full of crop circles. And it all depends what you think about them. I'd love some questions in advance of that class. That would be great.
So I will set up an advanced notice of that particular broadcast, and then maybe we'll just do it on YouTube, because I know with YouTube specifically, I could see all the comments from a broadcast I did earlier this morning. But to Jeremy's point, I mean, so we have so many different faces for the Northern Gateway and for Jeremy. So most of our content is shared through both first Jeremy's profiles and then onto the Northern Gateway. So we have both his YouTube channel and the Northern Gateways. If you could like and subscribe on both of those, that is awesome, because it just, you know, how those algorithms work. That would be awesome. And I'll post this little banner here. And then also we're going to be have our initiation coming up here. The Ostara initiation, which begins on Monday, the 26th, I believe it is, or is this at the 20th? I just went blank. It's a 7-week series, and it's a deeper dive into the stories. You know, one of which, of course, Jeremy mentions in this particular broadcast about going in the Green Knight, but it's so much more broader than that. But importantly about this is we just want to become more consistent in being able to come to the community with content and with conversations that are intriguing about the history and the cosmology of the North through a historian's lens. And then, of course, I come from the cosmic perspective more so than anything.
Yeah, and I love telling stories. I think they're great, and I never tell the same story twice. But that's the but the essence and the moral and the ethos of the story is always the same. And anyone who's interested in listening to stories and understanding how they can change our life by listening to these sagas, that's what the Northern Gateway is about, where we gather around a fire. And through storytelling, we pass the guardians of the Grail. And those are the seven guardians that we have to pass to enter Avalon. And what is Avalon to you? That's another whole question. But I believe it's a place we enter in our heart where we learn to believe and see and claim magic in our lives. I absolutely 100% believe it's out there if you open your heart and you can see it. Just like telling a story. When you tell a story and you tell it right, you see that spark light up in the eyes of children. And that's the best magic there is. Those words come to lives in pictures. So I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time.
And great. Just, I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden a whole bunch of comments from Facebook came through. So thank you. Thank you, Athena and Jenna and Sergey. And Jonathan wrote, it's time our country's history was told properly without prejudice. It's so hard to find accurate books on the subject. People like you, Jeremy, are keeping our history alive. So thank you.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and Rob speaks, my hometown of Runcorn features in the 5th season of The Last Kingdom. I'm going to have to catch up.
I'm watching that right at the minute, Rob.
Have to catch up for sure. And Susan is joining us from YouTube. All this is so nice. Thank you, guys. Now I can see where things are coming in. It looks like there's just a delay, so that makes me feel much better. And she just speaks to the fact, Jeremy, that she loves the way you tell the stories. And I agree. And I'll just say, just real briefly here, there is a tonation, a method within which you storytell and take people on journeys that really does open up the gateways, the portals for possibilities and a deeper resonance and immersion of or integration of that vibration. So yeah, it's always very profound.
You know, and I remember as a kid growing up in Wales, and Wales is a country that's full of myths and legends, and they have a thing called the Eisteddfod even to this day, where they all have a poetry competition and they perform their own. It doesn't matter if you're a tractor driver, the postman, you compete with bards to be the best bard of that year. They love telling stories, and I grew up around that when I was a child, and it was mesmerizing at school when they would tell the old tales. And it was like I used to wait for it, and that's the same energy that I believe filmmakers in Hollywood should have. They can't wait to tell the tale, to show people the riddle and myth in it, but also history. Give you all the facts, and then you make your own mind up, not change the facts. But this is actually, I've really enjoyed this. This has been lovely.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back more consistently. Right now, Talking with Wizards is going to be once a month, but I have a feeling that we'll be doing a lot more sharing since now we've kind of got ourselves dialed in. So, all right. With that, we will see you guys next time. Anything else, Jeremy, for you?
May the gods be with you guys. I can't wait to tell you another story.
All right. Ciao.